Now, the idea in this video is simple, but very useful for beginners and for experienced artists. If you don't know the concept already, this would get your drawing to a much more consistent high level. First of all, when you draw gradients and tone values, always keep in mind that you have to shade and draw what you see as accurately as you can. All the videos in this module helps with that. This is a point that for beginners, I want you to get so sick of hearing that it really stays with you and haunts you in your dreams. An example that you need to pay attention to. Be aware that gradients are not always linear like the basic exercises. Just because an area changes from one value to another doesn't mean it changes the same way. Example, black to white. It could change very linearly like the basic exercises. Or it can change like this, where it changes slowly then fast at the end. Or the opposite, or some chaotic variation. Beginners tend to unconsciously take shortcuts and ignore details like these. You see something that goes from black to white and you start drawing it and shading it, ignoring how it is changing, the details in between. That would be a mistake. This mistake more often happens at a very large and long gradient level or very small and detailed gradients. At mid-sized level, it still happens, but things are easier and clearer for you to see and evaluate, so it happens a bit less. Okay, onto the main concept of this video. There are pretty much certainly other smaller gradients and details on a larger patch of gradient that you are rendering that creates various details and forms. That's what you see on the reference. But conceptually, I want you to think about it this way. There is a hierarchy of structure and detail regarding whatever you are drawing. Like sculpturing, you start with a simplified large statement, the large form. Then there are smaller and more detailed forms built out of that, and then even smaller and finer details and forms that exist on top of that. Just as an example, say we are dealing with a portrait, the human head. The first stage of the human head, largest simplified structure of the subject, in this case the human head, is just a 3D oval shape. Or some of you may think of it as a sphere, then a more rectangular shape below it, like the Loomis method. Doesn't matter as long as you realize and can evaluate the tone value from this perspective, the large stuff first, and ignore anything that's more detailed. Any drawings you see goes from large simple structure to more detailed and smaller forms that builds on top of the previous one. Like layers, you don't have to draw in this order, but you should have the ability to understand and see things this way. So, back to my example, the human head is just an 3D oval, like those little art wooden dummies. Then there is the next level of 3D form detail, which is the eye sockets that goes inward, the nose and ears and lips that is protruding out from this larger 3D head. Then overall shape becomes more refined. Then there's next level of detail, the smaller round eyeballs that comes out of the eye sockets, the two nostrils that goes inside the nose, the wings beside the tip of the nose, those two smaller lobes, the particular shape of the nose bridge, the lips inside the ear, which is complicated. Then you get to the next level, iris and pupil of the eye, the skin fold, the lines on the lips, the tiny highlights and shadows, eyelashes, the slight dents at the corner of the mouth where the value is often slightly darker because it goes inward a little bit, it recedes a little bit. Okay, so what's the point of seeing things in terms of those hierarchy 3D forms with their respective gradients and shapes? Well, going from large, more comprehensive, simplified shapes to more and more refined details, the tone and shading gradient of the initial simplified large form is most important for you to shade correctly and making sure it remains correct at the end. The next level is slightly less important. You get a little bit of leeway to make mistakes. Ideally, you don't. And the next level, you get a little bit more leeway in terms of shading. This only relates to shading, tone value. You pretty much always need to get the proportions correct. That's next module. Okay, back to what I was saying. Ideally, you get tone value correct at each level, at all levels. But large one is most important, going to the details. By thinking this way, all the different elements of your drawing, their tone value will be correct and remain correct. The 3D form that you want the viewers to see. You won't make the mistake of having, say, this side of the temple and this part of the cheek having two very different values, unless some other elements interferes with it. Imagine if you made the eyelashes a bit too dark or light. The drawing probably still will look fine. and realistic. Now imagine if you made a mistake at the large form level, and the face, which is part of its oval or sphere shape, looks like it's caved in at the wrong places. Game over. If you're aiming for a realistic normal head, the drawing is ruined. One way to test this idea of having correct tone value I talked about is if you squint your eyes to make the drawing blurry such that smaller details are gone, and you stand far away. Your drawing should still look realistic, three-dimensional, and represent what you want the drawing to look like. This of course doesn't just apply to the face. The structure of a 3D environment, the shape of a mountain, can all be thought of in this manner. This is actually a quite advanced method of evaluating the reference and your drawing. Not the only one, but it is the most proper and flexible way. It's what expensive art schools would teach you, to think about and see tone values three-dimensionally. And in this hierarchy of consistency and importance regarding going from simple to more and more detailed forms. If you want the drawing to be really realistic, of course, the details you have to draw very accurately at every level. But you see how if you see since this way, you maintain the correct 3D form effect of your drawing. And it is always realistic and not like a cartoon. Sometimes due to light source, the overall face at the basic large level looks more flat. Still, the same principle applies. The larger surface has particular gradients and drawing should make sure that the larger surface remains correct. Often you see from references, and in reality, the temple part of the head is more flat. The cheeks is more flat. If that is reflected in the reference, you can use this and see this as the first layer of large simplified form. Like I mentioned, you don't have to draw it in this order, although you can, and often it's a good idea. But you should recognize the shade relating to each stage of the form. Many of you have seen a lot of my art videos, and often I dive straight into the details. But I evaluate my drawings in this manner, so you always end up as a realistic looking image. And for social media purposes, people like to see the eyes coming out first. It's more engaging. Now you should put ego aside and welcome criticism. For the evaluation drawings that many of you posted, the sphere and cube would pass this blurry but still looking realistic and three-dimensional test. Some of your drawings, if you do the test and you see very strong blurry outline, you have to ask yourself, do you see the black outlines in the reference? If no, then why are they in the drawing? You can use outline as a faint guide, but it shouldn't be there in the final result if it's not there in the reference. This is even more obvious for those of you ambitious enough to draw the portrait. A lot of your drawings shows outline of the face, but where do you see that on the reference? There's a little bit line of a different color, but the value difference is not that large. It's not going to be like a black line. If there is a strong outline on the reference, a realistic reference due to hair or some weird shadow, then it's fine. Otherwise, the face is just a complex mix of gradients and different tone values and shapes. The details may contain fine lines. At the large level, they're not going to be there. Now, don't remove your post. Leave them up there for posterity's sake. And, maybe before, after, later on. Now that you know to think about tone value in this hierarchy way, you can play around with simpler 3D forms or try again later. Also, by purposeful choice, you can have part of the drawing not be realistic. I often do the shoulder lines, and that's very purposefully done. I want the face to remain the center of the focus and be realistic. And I just want to give people an idea of roughly where the shoulder is. They are the supporting element. It does take time to see things this way and break out of the habit of reducing drawings to symbols and cartoonish outlines in the final result. But over time, you will improve and it will become effortless. So to drive the point home with another example, imagine if you are drawing lips. It is much more important to get the shading and value gradient of the entire lip correct than the details of like folding lines and highlight, if you do see them. The highlight could be 30% brighter or darker than it should be, and it would still look realistic. But if the shading and gradient of the lip is wrong by 30% at a larger level, it is gonna look really off. The perceived curvature could be too much or too flat, which would screw up the entire feature. If you shade the lips too dark, a guy could look like he has lipstick on. So from the large structure to details is the order of value, precision, importance. See, I mentioned this many times, so you don't have to watch this video over and over. Of course, again, we want to get all of them very accurate. But thinking this way, your final drawing will always look realistic and presenting this illusion of being three-dimensional. This applies to environment or any particular form. I could stand very far away from your drawing, not seeing the details clearly, and it's gonna always look realistic. Okay, next video for the next concept.